How often do you do this?
uh, Oops, you asked me that question right as we went live. So, uh-oh. How often do I do this? Well, it's kind of like a hobby that I do on the side. So as often as I have the inclination, I used to aim for like once a week, and that became kind of a lot. But then I sort of tended to go to
Right.
once a month, and now I'm trying to aim for like once a month, basically.
Mhm.
But anyway, we are live now,
Okay.
so sorry about that. Joining me today is a very special guest. Well, actually, I'm wondering, are we? Oh, no, we are. Okay, so it's hard to tell on YouTube sometimes. So, Kati, sorry about the miscommunication at the beginning, but can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know about you? Oops.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I think I will start a little bit, going back a little bit so that I explain where I am with regard to the philosophy community and analytic philosophy here in the U.S. So I've come to the U.S. from Hungary, and I grew up there. So I grew up in communist Hungary, and maybe I say something about what made me interested in philosophy in the first place,
Yes, please.
and and what I can say about this for sure is that in my youth uh, in communist Hungary, as I said, the public discourse and generally just the discourse that we were expected to engage in any sort of official capacity was just so maddeningly vapid and confusing and very hard to understand. I felt like a lot of what was said and what I was expected to say just had no discernible connection to reality. And uh, and I have this um, bug in me that I guess a lot of philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, have, that I would like to get clear about things.
Hmm.
So my first encounter with analytic philosophy was I will say in a minute what it was, but when I first encountered it, I felt like this is the first time that I see some systematic activity that allows me to, hone this, my ability and my satisfy my desire to become clear about things. Ironically, the very first philosophy book I read was Gilbert Ryle's Concept of Mind, which I came to detest later on.
Oh no. So
But-
okay, interesting.
so that was the first book, and then I read a bunch of others. I was interested in philosophy of science, so I read Kuhn and Feyerabend and Lakatos, which were at that time popular authors. I turned away from that. But so this is just to say that's what turned me towards analytic philosophy. However, my background otherwise was much more congruent with continental philosophy concerns. So I grew up studying and being involved, interested in literature and art uh, and psychoanalysis, humanistic type psychology, and so nevertheless, the continental authors I read, were just very unsatisfactory to me. Like, what are they saying? It's just like I don't know. So I that's how I became an analytic. I came to the U.S. I became a grad student at Rutgers, and I became an analytic philosopher
Mhm.
here. But I'm just saying this to indicate that my recent work is a little bit turning away again from analytic philosophy, and this is just for background that there are reasons why that is happening, that maybe somehow in my background. But anyway, so I'm a philosopher of mind. That's what my work mostly is concerned with, and especially I've been working on the mind-body problem, which was the time when I was coming up as a graduate student. It was um, there was renewed interest in that. Now, I'm interested in the mind-body problem, especially from the point of view of consciousness,
Right.
not so much from the point of view of intentionality, which is also interesting and was the earlier concern, mainly, in the 50s and 60s. But I'm interested in consciousness and um, how consciousness fits into the physical world, that part of the mind-body problem, which David Chalmers calls the hard problem. So that's um, that's the problem that I've thought about most and written about most. The status of consciousness and its relation to the physical world, and and I approached it from a particular point of view, from the point of view of our awareness of consciousness and our introspective awareness of consciousness, the way that we think about it, the way we conceptualize our conscious states. And I came to believe, not all by myself, I was Brian Lohr's student. He was my dissertation advisor, and Brian Lohr came up, I think, first with this idea that later was became known as the phenomenal concept strategy, where he was focusing uh, on the mind-body problem, not from the point of view of what sort of metaphysical specialness consciousness has, but from the point of view of the cognitive status of our knowledge and awareness of consciousness. So he started talking about recognitional concepts, and that recognitional concepts that the recognitional concepts we have of consciousness give rise to all the well-known puzzles about consciousness, the conceivability of zombies, the explanatory gap, um, um, the the incorrigibility of certain phenomenal judgments and so on. And so that's how I got into the philosophy of mind. Being interested in that, whole concept of how we can tackle this metaphysical issue from the point of view of our cognitive architecture and from the point of view of how we form concepts, and especially I got especially interested in introspection of consciousness because I also believe that the first person perspective that it involves um, has an interesting status, not only in philosophy but generally in contemporary culture, as opposed to the third person ways of understanding things and understanding the world. So I came to see introspection phenomenal concept as the key in many diverse issues that I became interested in, and that's what ties together pretty much all of my interests. So the interest in the mind-body problem, my interest in the change of the concept of mind, in the last 300-400 years, which I started writing about. My interest in the relationship between value and consciousness, and my interest in how various metaphysical views about consciousness actually are tied up with practical concerns through this connection between introspection and value.
I guess I want to kind of start about consciousness and the phenomenal concept strategy, and then ask you about this contemplation stuff and illusionism. I might find myself in the unusual situation of trying to be friendly towards illusionism. which is not a position I find myself in often. But just so we don't gang up on them, I might take that view because I generally agree with you that well, anyway, we'll get to what I generally think. But I'm curious about your views. So when you're talking about consciousness, you agree with me, I think, that we're talking about phenomenal consciousness. That's the Nagel sense of it. Um, and yet there's this deep sense, and according to many people, that this thing can't be a part of the physical world, and that it's somehow like a category mistake or simple-minded, or like, I don't know. I've heard some people use very strong language that it's inconceivable or impossible, that this thing that we're talking about could be physical. And indeed, some people even associate the very term phenomenal consciousness with just like whatever is non physical about consciousness. And so I think that we both agree, and I've talked about this many times, that we disagree with this way of characterizing things. Even though we agree about what phenomenal consciousness is, we want to insist that there's a way to understand it's from a physical standpoint. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so can you just give us a little bit more about your side of why do you think it's important to defend physicalism, or what do you think matters about this debate before we get to any of the like stuff about, is it a terminological issue? Just generally, is there something at issue here that's worth defending, do you think?
Yeah, I definitely, I think there is an issue worth thinking about. I'm not sure anymore that it's worth defending, either side, in exclusion to the other. I'll get to that. My view now is that there is really the two views that are the most plausible is physicalism and property dualism of the kind that accepts the causal closure principle, that is, the principle that every physical event can be explained by a prior physical event.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that these are the two most plausible. People will disagree with me, there are panpsychists and neutral monists and idealists, and but I came to the conclusion after, surveying this field for a while that these are the two most plausible candidates for um, having the true view on the mind-body problem.
And those
But
two were epiphenomenalists and physicalism?
physicalism and I would say over-determinist dualism, because epiphenomenalist dualism is just a little too much to, I think.
Okay, so overdeterminism of some sort.
Yeah, so that kind of dualism, that um, property dualism, that not the epiphenomenalist version, but the overdetermination version.
Can I
So
ask a technical question here? Is this because I saw a talk of yours, and I think it was in a paper at one point where you called it um, non-interactive dualism, or is that's different than what you're talking about right now, right?
yeah, that's different. I think that I put it not in the way that I would put it now, because non-interactive, just in the sense that accepting causal closure, that the mind is not an independent force
I see.
in, the world doesn't have an independent causal power, but that doesn't mean that the best version of that view would be
I
epiphenomenalist.
see. That's where the
Rather, I
overdeterminism
think,
is what you're
yeah,
saying, right?
rather I think that the best version is overdetermination of of physical, behavioral events by prior physical events and prior mental events.
Uh huh. Okay. So I understand now. So you would want to rule out just kind of any interactive dualism, like I'm thinking of maybe like quantum dualism of the kind that David Chalmers and Kelvin MacLean have it. Is it McLean or McQueen? I don't know. I'm not where the L goes. I'm sorry, but yeah. So what do you think about those kind of interactive dualistic views? You just find them implausible?
That consciousness collapses the wave function, that kind of thing.
Or yeah,
Well,
that consciousness is an M property that doesn't go into superposition and therefore resists in such a way so as to cause something that looks like a collapse. Or there's different ways of spelling that idea out. But yeah, do you don't think those are?
Well, I think I just have to pass on that because that's beyond my pay grade. Despite the fact that I'm married to a philosopher of physics, I really don't feel like I know enough about that. It's yeah.
Okay, cool. And so you're not too especially worried about like a priori entailment of phenomenal facts from like physical, fundamental, microphysical facts, or is that something that you think is optional? Like you could go for that? Because I was talking with Barbara Montero recently, and she's arguing against that as a definition of physicalism, and so I'm just curious, like how much you think a physicalist truly is committed to these kinds of like definitional claims that people, which when you think about it, are usually offered to us by the non-physicalists. So I don't know if that's a reason to reject them, but it's a reason to go, is that really the most friendly way to set up the debate? So I wondered if, or do you think that that is what physicalism is committed to, this kind of modal claim about possible worlds and such?
Well, physicalism is committed to the idea that everything that's true in our world is necessitated by the physical truth, but that's not an a priori entailment. That's a metaphysical entailment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I when I put on my physicalist hat, I definitely deny the a priori entailment thesis, which would say that, which would claim more strongly than what I said, is that the full physical description of the world a priori entails, every truth about the world. And I don't think that that's true, as I say in my physicalist incarnation, especially because of truths involving consciousness. They're definitely not a priori entailed by the physical, as is evidenced by the conceivability of zombies, the explanatory gap, and so on. All of those arguments against physicalism appeal to the idea that the a priori entailment fails between the physical and the
Yeah. I guess
and,
this is one
and,
place maybe where we
and
disagree
the
a little
phenomenon.
bit because I sort of think maybe zombies are inconceivable and
Mhm.
only seem conceivable prima facie, given our limited understanding of the science of consciousness. But
But
that's a we could
you don't want
debate.
to say like, you think they're inconceivable?
Say that again.
You want to say more about why you think they're inconceivable?
Yeah, well, a part of like, so I know we have, appealed to similar ideas in the past and maybe use them in slightly different ways. So, like in your work, you've called them Illuminati, the mere physical duplicates that have consciousness. And Keith Frankish has called such creatures like anti zombies. And in my own work, I call these creatures shambies. And I sort of found out about these things after I was already writing this paper and presenting it at a conference, and I was like, oh, there's all these, and it goes, there's these ideas out there. But the basic idea that I think the way I was using this idea is slightly different, although maybe we can find out, is that I was thinking that when I hear someone say that zombies are conceivable, it sounds like they're begging the question to me because I feel like if we truly knew all the physical facts about the way the brain works or something, or had a good theory about it even, then we would start to know what is or isn't conceivable. Like, for example, water being H2O. I think it's fine that Aristotle found it conceivable that water was an H2O, but now I can't find that conceivable because I know enough chemistry. So I sort of think that what changed is that there was a theory that was well confirmed, and that now what's conceivable changes, and what seems commonsensical is different, and it would have been different for Aristotle than for me, given our knowledge of chemistry, and so forth. So I feel like maybe that could happen with consciousness, and to kind of illustrate that, I say, well, think of the Shambi, a creature that's physical but with consciousness. And there's no non physical things at this world, just the physically conscious being. Um, so I think that's a conceivable thing. Um,
Well, not only conceivable, the physicalist thinks it's the actual thing, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that to
Um,
say that that's inconceivable, or to say that no, that seems to beg the question against the opponent. But
so
but
we
when
disagree a little bit there.
but the way I
And,
tried to press this
yeah,
argument, just to finish, is against the
sure.
dualist, was to say, look, we can grant you the CP thesis. We can say that whatever's conceivable is a priori is possible, and therefore can tell us about the way the actual world is. But if my thing is conceivable, then your view is wrong. But if your thing is conceivable, then my view is wrong. So now, how are we going to see which one is the conceivable one, short of arm wrestling or like some other, like, I don't know. It just seems inconceivable to me to have a physical thing like me, but no consciousness. You say that isn't. So I just don't. So to me, it seems like it was a more dialectically engaging way of present the argument. Say, give them the a prioriness, and then say, but still, your view, you can't just assume that these things are conceivable because my thing is conceivable, or your thing, the Illuminati, or Keith's thing, the anti-zombie. So I am curious what you think about that as like the rhetorical, the dialectical strategy.
Well, first of all, I disagree with you in that you started by saying that, well, you don't even think that zombies are conceivable, right?
I said they.
Which I don't know how that fits in with the rest, but let me just say something about that first.
Okay.
That I disagree there because my theory of phenomenal concepts will explain why zombies are conceivable and why they have to be conceivable because our concepts of our phenomenal states are not in any way similar to pretty much any other concepts, functional, structural, physical, whatever. Like water, for example, that we conceive of as according to Kripke, the potable, transparent liquid, whatever. That's not how we conceive of our conscious states. We conceive of them directly by attending to them and by turning those very states into a representation of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, those concepts will not connect in any way, like like say, a functional concept concept connects with physical concepts. They will be isolated from physical concepts because they pick out their referent in this very special, direct way. And so that's why I think that zombies are conceivable.
Right.
Now,
No, I
you're
grant that, but you have to. Maybe you don't have to, but would you agree that uh, well, assumes that that phenomenal concept strategy is true, which I know you want to defend and you agree, but it could be wrong, I think. And if it were wrong, I don't think that means physicalism would be wrong. So that if there were, so that there's another way to defend physicalism is kind of, I guess, what I'm saying. So I'm not trying to disagree with the way you're setting things up, but I think that
I see.
even if you turned out to be wrong about all that stuff you said, it wouldn't refute physicalism on my view, because um, of the things that I was saying. So yeah, I wasn't trying to object or provide a counter to the phenomenal concepts way of dealing with things
So,
because I like
so,
that
so
as
I think that
well.
there's, with regard to, so Chalmers' argument is, like, just put it in a very simple terms, is that um, the physical being how it is and there being no phenomenal properties is conceivable. If that is conceivable, that is possible.
Mm-hmm.
If if it's possible, then physicalism is false. That's in a nutshell,
Yeah.
the conceivability argument. And there are various ways in which people have tried to refute that argument, and we have to sort of uh, make a distinction between two ways of construing that argument and two ways of refuting that argument. Um, Originally, when Dave Chalmers suggested that argument in the 1996 book, The Conscious Mind, he used the concept of negative conceivability to flesh out the argument. And that way of putting the argument, I think, has a pretty much a knockdown refutation. That's my zombie refutation, that there are zombies who could give the same argument, but their conclusion would be false by assumption, and therefore there must be a premise that is wrong in the original argument. That's, to think about it in terms of negative conceivability. But later on, Dave Chalmers put the zombie argument in terms of positive conceivability, which is a more demanding notion, although not 100% clear what it is, but it's something like if you conceive of a scenario in a positive manner, then you're able to construct, in your mind, a scenario that would satisfy that, you're able to construct some state of affairs that would make, that scenario true.
Right.
And if you take it that way, so for example, your Shombi argument, you would have to claim that Shombis, just like zombies, are positively conceivable.
Yeah,
right?
I do claim that.
Now, yeah. So now the question is, so I kind of like that argument, because I think, if zombies are positively conceivable, why not zombies? Although, as I said, I'm not 100% sure I understand what positive conceivability requires, really. But I'm kind of sympathetic to that argument, because once you have the positive conceivability of zombies, it would be special pleading to say, well, but zombies are impossible because of the conceivability argument, because then you could say, well, the conceivability, you can turn the argument against the dualist in the same way, saying that the CP principle, together with the positive conceivability of zombies, implies that physicalism is true.
Well, I would say that dualism is false, but yes, exactly.
Or the dualism
just
is
to
false,
make it
yeah.
a perfect parity.
Right. So you can turn the argument against the dualist.
But you have to, and so I think maybe I'm okay with doing that, because I'm like half a rationalist in a way. Like I'm sort of like interested in that CP principle, but I'm also very interested in just hardcore empiricism. So I like both views, but I just think that if rationalism turned out to be true and the CP principle turned out to be true, physicalism wouldn't be false as a result. But everybody was walking around saying like that was the real nexus of the debate, and that if they turned out to be right about the CP principle, then oh no. And I was like, what? They're begging the question by assuming that we're wrong at the big. So, and we're letting them get away with it. So that was
well, there's something still would be. I feel. I think, Richard, something would still be wrong with the CP principle if it leads to contradictory conclusions in arguments.
Oh no, my view would be that in ideal conditions, only one of those would be conceivable, but that under current conditions, we don't know which one it is.
yeah. Okay, I got it. But okay, so but let me say where I see the dialectic is that I like this argument, the positive appealing to positive conceivability, but I would like to not have to do that,
Right.
given how murky that notion is. And that's where I think that the phenomenal concept strategy comes in. And okay, so now having said that, I for a long time, I was arguing for physicalism on the basis of the phenomenal concept strategy, saying that you can really diffuse the CP principle with the phenomenal concept strategy and show that physicalism is, a coherent, full metaphysical picture of the world.
Right.
It explains mental causation. It explains. It gives a satisfactory account of modality, and also it explains why the puzzles about consciousness arise. It gives a very nifty explanation of exactly that.
It does,
Why
yes.
puzzles of consciousness arise and why they don't have a metaphysical ramifications. Now, having said that, you can argue like that, but the dualist can just stick to their guns and say, look, the whole thing just doesn't get off the ground even because the CP principle shows that blah blah blah. And so you can dig in your heels. If you're a dualist, you can say, well, I have a perfect full metaphysical picture of the world. I can explain mental causation if I squint a little bit, and I have a beautiful account of modality. And I can totally explain, why the physicalist is wrong and so on. So they can both dig in their heels, and if you have been around for a while, like I have been, you become like exasperated by
Yes.
that. Where is this going? It's not going anywhere because it seems to be like a gridlock, like an a situation where there is no resolution in sight. We have two views that each can defend themselves against the other, and um, and explain why they are right and the other is wrong, each of them. And so I came to a view now, which is a different view, and which I call dialectical monism. That's a new, it's a
Yes.
new kid of the block. Although I don't think that many people, it's like rolls of many people's lips yet, because it's not been around. It's in a paper that's coming out now in the Kripke volume.
Oh,
Um,
very cool. Okay, I didn't know it was coming out.
yeah, it's coming out in the Kripke volume, and so the idea there being that dualism and physicalism, once we accept the causal closure principle, which I think that the reasonable versions of dualism and of course physicalism as well does,
Hmm.
you know, they don't manage to say anything different anymore. So go back to Descartes. Descartes, was an interactionist dualist, and there was something he was saying. Well, the mind is an independent force in nature. We cannot explain a lot of things like language and reasoning and other things. We can't even try to explain without positing that there is such a thing as a soul that's an independent actor in the world, that causes things in the physical realm. And then there was um, a real stakes between physicalism and dualism, a real empirical disagreement, and all of the work of Woodland. But the minute you give that up, that mind has this independent role to causal role to play, the disagreement, I believe, now fizzles. And by the way, I just was talking with somebody and gave this this analogy that imagine someone says there is a God, the God is immaterial, but it or he or she is unable to do anything in the world.
Yeah.
It's not doing anything. And you say, what? Hello, what's that? so so once you
Yes.
say that the mind, the mind is something that it's immaterial and it's nothing physical, and but it's not able to influence the physical, there's something weird there.
Hmm.
That's why we don't believe in the soul anymore. But but dualism survives in the form of um, property dualism, over-determinist property dualism. So that property dualist doesn't say that the mind is just sitting there idle. It
Hmm.
says, well, it's just doing in unison everything with the physical, right?
Right.
But so what I'm saying is that both of these views, that kind of dualism and physicalism, both of them are true. They seem to contradict each other, but they don't really. Why not? Because they appeal to different notions of property. So
Hmm.
when they think about the world in the most at its most fundamental level, properties, entities, etc., they use different notions of property that they have different concepts of property. The dualist notion of property has a requirement, makes us a close connection between properties and concepts that are embodied in, like principles like the CP principle, or, Kripke's transparency principle, that if you have two rigid designators that each, denote the referent, pick out the referent via essential properties, there only could be an identity if that identity is a priori. So that you can sort of put the same idea or similar idea in different ways, different transparency theses. But so that transparency thesis is merely a way in which you think about what properties fundamentally are. They are kind of things that are related with concepts in this way. Mm-hmm. And the physicalist thinks, no, there is no such constraint or requirement on properties. And now we have two kind of rival notions of property going, but not as if, in my view, not as if one of them, has the right view of what a property is and the other has the wrong view of what a property is, as if there was some God's eye view of the world in which, the God sees what a property really is, and then we just have to compare our notions to that. I think that we can't really even think about the world at that fundamental level without already conceptualizing it one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And I want to say, to me, this seems plausible that either notion is a fine notion of property, is a fine notion to build a worldview on. But if you take one notion, dualism comes out true. If you take the other notion, physicalism comes out true, but not because they say different things about the world. It's because they have, they use a different conceptual scheme mm-hmm. from each other. So that's dialectical monism, that the disagreement is a very deep conceptual disagreement and not a disagreement in fact, really.
So first, my first question about dialectical monism, which I like, and you could almost, I want to get back to how it might relate to the Shambies versus zombies dispute, because you could almost see, like, from your point of view, how I think you would think about that situation. But I want to ask you about that. But anyway, so I wanted to ask if like, is this related to the Carnapian distinction between internal and external questions, what you get from like the history of philosophy, or is that not related to what you're trying to get at here?
It's probably related, but I'm not, enough well versed in that to really relate my view to that. So I think that idea is actually quite simple. And I mean, you might think about it this way, that yes, like, that what's at stake is different conceptual schemes in which, in which to think about the world. But I think that my idea is rather simple and doesn't require, any kind of fancy metaphysics, philosophy of language ideas behind it. It's just, the idea is simply that, you can have terminological disputes, we know them, that there are many, they abound, and normally they are resolvable because there is some bedrock of facts, some bedrock, description of the world.
Right. But this is the bedrock.
But this is the bedrock,
right.
So tough luck, when it's the bedrock that we disagree on, that there's no resolution. Nevertheless, it's still a conceptual disagreement and not a factual one.
Okay, so I think I sort of understand the view. It seems like I get it, and then it slips away because So I want to try to understand what you might say about like the world we live in. There is consciousness, um, but if you're so I guess how do I put this? If you're a dualist, then you think that the world could have been such that there wasn't consciousness. Not simply from an epistemic point of view, but like from a metaphysical point of view, that it could have turned out that way. And
Mm-hmm.
then so you're motivated to look for an explanation for why it didn't turn out that way, hence the hard problem, maybe, and so forth and so on. Whereas from the other side, you might not be so motivated um, to do that. And you'll invoke the phenomenal concept strategy as a way to explain anyone who was so motivated to do that. So, but don't you exactly precisely need to invoke some sort of explanation for why the world didn't turn out that way, which does seem to suggest that maybe you know something is resolvable.
Um, that it could have turned out that there is no consciousness.
Yeah, so that if the duelists are right, then we could be sitting here having this conversation and
Yeah,
be zombies. And their
yeah,
question is always like, but why isn't it that way? That's the way I hear Chalmers' hard problem is like how come on earth there's consciousness when like we could have done all this without consciousness?
yeah.
And then you're saying I say I'm an identity theorist at heart, so I say you can't have done this without consciousness because these states which are doing that, these physical things, that is consciousness. So of course, anyway, so to me that looks like where the dispute is over whether the world could have been different. And you're saying that's a terminological issue, whether the world could
No,
have.
well,
And that's what I'm under. That's what I'm trying to understand. Is like, is that what you're saying? Is a terminal? Is even at that level where we're talking about how the world could have went down a different path?
yeah, I think that's a very good point. But let me turn on the light because I just checked my self view and I see that,
Oh yeah, okay.
that I don't have light here.
Descending into darkness.
Yeah,
Yeah, the sun is going down. It's early. I mean, we're on the East Coast, so
yeah.
um,
Because I turned off the self view, but just checked in if and I looked a little. Anyway, so yeah, so that's a very very good point, an interesting point, and I think that my view will have to say that because of the different notions of property involved, that will percolate into your notion of modality. So different things will be possible, obviously. On you will say that different things are possible, depending on whether you use the dualist scheme or the physicalist scheme. But again, that's not because there is you know, something about the world that is, makes one uniquely true and the other false. The world as it is makes both of them true in their own conceptual scheme. So that's sort of the outlines of the answer. But of course, more needs to be said about it,
yeah.
and I'm not sure if we should really try to go very deep into the weeds here.
Okay, I do like
But you see what
I
I'm
do like the
saying?
weeds, but so I wonder if I could ask if you will take this same sort of sanguine view, if I may say so, in not a pejorative way, but like just like this is okay that it turns out this way, um, towards like issues about functionalism and consciousness with respect to AI and biological entities. And because this is a slightly different issue than physicalism and dualism, but it is kind of in a way sort of related. So that someone like me who's like friendly to biological naturalism, because I like the identity theory, is going to tend to say,
Mhm.
well, these AI things, they no matter how much they duplicate us, they can't be conscious unless that view is wrong, which maybe it is. But that seems to me like a real important issue because a lot of stuff about morality, how we ought to treat these things, really hangs now all of a sudden on whether something like the identity theory is true or something like computational functionalism is true. And so that seemed to me like a real important issue. That's the key, that doesn't look terminological, right? So would you agree that in
It
that
doesn't.
case that's different?
That's definitely doesn't look terminological, and I think we would have to be very careful to think about that because I just off the top of my head, I think that the question of whether um, any given type of AI is conscious, let's say that LLMs are not yet conscious. I don't think it's likely that they are, but there might be some future iterations of AI that is a candidate, let's say, for consciousness. Maybe it satisfies the global workplace theory or hot theory or whatever
Exactly.
theory you have of consciousness.
Some ridiculous theory of consciousness. Exactly.
Yeah, some ridiculous theory of consciousness, and and um, and I want to say two things about it. One is that there is a matter of fact about it, and that's independent of whether we are dualist or physicalist.
Hmm.
No matter in which scheme we are thinking about it, whether something comes out as conscious is, it's not going to depend on how we think of the nature of property, whether it involves close connection with concepts or not.
Hmm.
Um, so the dualist and the physicalist don't generally disagree on what things are conscious in the world, right?
Right.
They disagree on the metaphysical nature of those conscious individuals.
Okay.
So I don't think that that depending on which scheme we think about, we will come to different conclusions about whether there is a matter of fact about consciousness. I think either way, David Papino would disagree because he thinks that there is a terminal vagueness in, because we are physicalists, we have to admit that there's a terminal vagueness in the concept of consciousness, but I don't believe so.
Okay.
So I think that there is a matter of fact, but with regard to AI consciousness, I also believe that we will never know for sure,
Hmm.
or with any reasonable certainty, if as unless we duplicate ourselves, completely, like some artificial biological, um, or maybe Dave Chalmers is right, and it's a substrate independent matter, and we can simulate, like down to the, fundamental physical level, we can simulate human beings, and then those simulated beings will be conscious. Um, Possibly, but I think because of the way we think about consciousness, that prevents us from ever really knowing
Hmm.
of what consciousness is, because of this, as I was uh, explaining before, that I think that the way that we form concepts of our conscious states is we attend to them. So like right now, I'm attending to the temperature sensations in this room, or I'm sitting in this chair and attending to all of that sensations. And by attending to them, I make them into concepts that represent themselves. So that's a very special way of, no other concept is really constituted by its referent in this way.
Right.
That matters. I mean, maybe the concept atom is, you know, in, when you're thinking in your head, is constituted by atoms, but it's not referring to atoms because of that fact. And
Exactly.
but in the case of phenomenal concepts, yes, the way that is constituted by that very experience that you are picking out, the zeroing in on in your attention, that is really why it refers to that state,
Right.
right?
So
And,
you.
and
Sorry.
so it's unlike any of our concepts, any of our third personish concepts. It's unlike any of our third personish concepts. And therefore, no matter what, we'll see that, the AI does this, it does that, and it says it's conscious. And I mean, people are not crazy and they think that they can just interview AI, whether it's conscious or not. But, but, but whatever criterion, like serious criteria we have, about it, you will never know if that's the right one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's the right level of functional, organization, whether more fine-grained organization is involved, or less fine. So there's all sorts of ways in which it's just not possible to know if
Do,
AI
do,
will be conscious. And I think that's a hugely big argument against trying to achieve conscious AI. And it's not the only argument. I think there is many arguments
mm.
against that, but
But do you take, do you, would, not to distract too much from what you're saying, because I want to follow up on that, but would you take the same view about non-human animals, that there's just no way to know whether they're conscious for like similar sorts of reasons, or would you rely more on the biological similarity in those cases?
I guess I would, I think it's natural to rely more on the biologic, because we know that evolution came up with consciousness, and with highly specific ways, with central nervous systems, and so on and so forth. So we know that happened, and animals, show all sorts of other signs of their consciousness, but we can rely on the fact that we are of the same process, evolutionary process as they are. But when it comes to AI, there's nothing like that to rely on. So
Mm-hmm.
so I mean, you can be skeptical of animal consciousness at the level of insects and whatever, and I think that you will never know, probably, where is the cutoff, where does consciousness start in nature. You 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 probably never know. So there is an uncertainty even in the biological world, but certainly, with regard to AI, it's just never be possible to know.
Okay. Well, just real quickly on this AI thing, since it seems like you're open to the possibility of AI consciousness, even if we could never know, it seems like you're saying there would be a fact of the matter,
Yeah,
possibly, right? That it could be
yeah,
conscious, and
yeah.
it seems like you're open to that possibility because of a priori reasoning, which seems to
I'm
under.
open to the possibility, because I think that our conscious experiences are correlated with brain states that have, you know a whole, like, continuum of description in various functional ways, and uh, and we just don't know if consciousness requires biological substrate, or it's some sort of
Mhm.
functional state, and if so, at which level, because all of it is compatible with what we know about human consciousness. All of that is compatible with everything that we might know about human consciousness.
I
And
think
so, and so, yeah.
this is
and,
why I
and so
wanted to press you on this though, because it seems like you're ending up at a similar place where you ended up in the physicalism dualism debate, and yet you want to say it's different here, but you're ending up at a place where like they're both equally. You could say one, you could say it is conscious, you could say it's not conscious. It depends on like what point of view you're taking. But yet you want to say no. There's something here that even though we can't know which way it is, there is a way, and it
Mhm.
matters. And over in the physicalist debate, you're saying it's different. That's what I was trying to figure out, like in your own thinking, like why you're making that distinction.
Well, um,
Or if
I
I'm
was
wrong, maybe I
I
might be
was
wrong
I
too.
was trying to say, but you sort of not buying it, apparently, is
Oh,
that
sorry.
that um, so my theory about how physicalism and dualism are equally true descriptions of reality. As I said, it doesn't imply that there will be differences in the way that the world is described with regard to its physical and conscious, the distribution of its physical and consciousness properties. Both dualist and physical, I mean, dualist and physicalist, that's not what they disagree about. Um, Whether, humans are conscious or dogs are conscious, or what physical properties um, exist in the world. They don't disagree in that. What they disagree about is just some, you know, fundamental, arcane metaphysical truths about all of that. So there are consciousness D properties, consciousness P properties, and they will be the same. The same individuals will have them in their respective systems.
Yeah.
So so I don't think that I'm somehow now committed to saying that, once I believe in dialectical monism, I will have to say that, well, it's equally true that something is conscious and that it's not conscious. No, I think that there is a matter of fact about whether something is conscious. And um, and I don't see any reason,
Well,
why
I
the dualist.
wasn't saying that exactly. I guess what I was trying to say was that so in the physicalist, I thought maybe because I do keep, like I said, it keeps going out of focus for me. So maybe, and I do want to talk about illusionism. So someday I'll, give up on this and ask about that. But um, I thought you were saying that in a way they're both true, like physicalism and dualism are both true. And it just kind of depends on like which definition of property you kind of like. And you could pick either one because there's no really good reason for us to like one over the other. So you could pick the D property, the dualist property, and then you end up being a dualist. Or you can pick the physicalist conceptual properties, and you end up being a physicalist. But like it's tomato tomato type thing, six of one, half a dozen of the other. It's like great. Uh, so it's not that no one's conscious on your view. I thought just that you were like they're both true, kind of as a matter of preference or inclination or something, not
Yeah.
deep. And then I was wondering, okay, so here's another debate about physicalism, not physicalism, about computational functionalism versus biological naturalism. And here, you want to say, well, we'll never know which one of these really ultimately is true in a way, because we can't know whether the computer is conscious or the cricket in ultimate, some deep sense. Um, so is this a case where it's or both are true that from one point of view the cricket is conscious and the AI is also or not, or vice versa that the other point of view the cricket is not conscious, um, and maybe it depends on whether you think that consciousness requires concepts or I don't know. So you would have to spell something out like that, but maybe so. I was wondering, like on your view, is it going to turn out to be simultaneously true, both of them, in this other debate? And you were saying no. So that's what I was trying to figure out. It's not that you're committed to it being vague or somehow but anyway, that both were true. That the computer is conscious from one like equally plausible way of looking at things, and that also the computer is not conscious from another equally plausible way of looking at things.
Yeah, well, I can only say to that I don't see how the disagreement that in the fundamental concept of property would lead to that conclusion. And I just don't see why it would lead to that conclusion. You only have to look at how dualists and physicalists actually talk about, you know, uh, actual conscious beings in the world. There is no big disagreement about, well, I'm a dualist and I think, crickets are conscious. I'm a physicalist. I think they are not. I mean,
But
that's not the disagreement.
you're right about that. I don't know if you're right about that, but you do find a kind of like um, you're not facing up to the hard problem of consciousness, you physicalist people, versus you're inflating the world with magical stuff, you dualist people. You do find that kind of rhetoric out there where the dualists are saying of the physicalists, you're like, well, you're not really talking about consciousness. And then we have to go, yeah, we are. But so, like, doesn't that? It seems to me like that suggests that there is something at issue here that's like that
They
case
always
about
say we
the
are not talking about consciousness because they think that physicalism doesn't make sense, that it's a priori true that if physicalism is true, there is no consciousness. So that's why they're accusing physicalists of not talking about consciousness.
But aren't they right
But
though on your view?
No, they're not right that that we are not talking about consciousness. They write that. Okay, so are they right to say that what physicists say is false? Well, absolutely in their own conceptual scheme, but they don't realize that they're not speaking the same language.
Hmm.
So in their scheme, it's obviously false that that consciousness is physical. Yeah, but not in the physical scheme. I mean that's why I think that this view, my view, the dialectical monist view, actually gives a simple and satisfying explanation of why it's so intractable.
Hmm.
This dispute is so intractable because you're never going to accept that the other side the other side's point of view because you're simply not speaking the same language.
Interesting.
So I think that that's an explanation, and I just don't see why that dispute about the nature of consciousness, whether it's physical or not, would somehow impact your judgments about individual beings, whether they are conscious or not, and it doesn't.
Right. Maybe there's some
There's no
other
such thing.
like some other fundamental ambiguity that might though. So and I think this is
Yeah,
interesting. So that's the kind of what I was. I wasn't exactly saying that it's this ambiguity that leads you to that. But once you're prepared to accept an ambiguity at the fundamental level, and then you find a debate that looks similar in its dialectical structure, would that lead you to start to look around for some other kind of terminological fundamental type thing around? That's kind of what I was thinking. Not that your thing about properties led you here, but rather that once you take your view and you like it, and you look over there, wouldn't you want to apply the same strategy?
yeah, yeah. Well, no.
Okay. Exactly. Okay. Yeah, and what's interesting about this as well is that when David Chalmers' book, the Constructing the World, came out, I wrote a book review of it, and and basically I made the argument that yeah, he wins, he gets like a pyrrhic victory, because if you mean one thing by consciousness, his view comes out right, but if you mean something else by it, his view comes out wrong. But that's not exactly what you're saying either, because what you're saying, you're not saying that the ambiguity is in the concept of consciousness, since you're saying that we both agree, or they both agree, that consciousness is what it's like from the first person point of view, subjective
Yeah.
Nagel stuff. So the
Yeah, I
ambiguity is
guess
somewhere
I'm very,
else.
yes, I'm very old school about that. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's just the case, and it's non-negotiable. And all the kind of newfangled idea that, oh no, consciousness really is some sort of representational concept or functional concept, or it's just actually a misrepresentation. It doesn't even represent it. I think that those views are just wrong. So I'm old school about that. I think there is consciousness, and the way we conceive of it is this way
Mm-hmm.
of by attention turning them into their own representations, and I think that that explains a lot about many things, about metaphysics, but also um, about attitudes towards um, ethics broadly construed, about how we relate to our own consciousness, what role it plays in our life. So it's a very central issue in my understanding that explains many things about human beings.
Interesting. And so I know we're getting on in time, and before the heat death of the universe, or me in this room, since now it's very very cold. My window's open. But anyway, so I want to talk about illusionism, because I think what you just said kind of brings up that topic, because one of prominent strand of these kinds of persons who are making this move is that what we are talking about, phenomenal consciousness, this what it's like business, is a kind of illusion on the part of the introspector. And I'm very suspicious of illusionists as well. So I think I like this strand of your work, but you also go a little bit further and make the argument that this is like a final step in a kind of degranularization of humans or something like that. which is dangerous in some sense. And so I wondered, if we could talk about that. I know you have other things to do, and but if you have time to broach, I know it's a huge topic, but maybe we could spend the last bit of our time talking about that, if you don't mind.
Well, there's nothing I would rather do than explain this.
Okay.
This is I really feel very strongly about this. Um, and yeah, so this leads to um, what I was trying at the beginning to explain that although I come from a background where I really appreciated analytic philosophy and the rigor and the aiming for clarity that good analytic philosophy gives you. But at the same time, I grew a little bit disenchanted with the narrow focus, kind of the narrow mindedness of analytic philosophy, where certain topics, just seem to be out of bounds, topics that I feel are important. And in particular, when I started thinking about illusionism and putting it in this like historical perspective that you indicated, that I think it's an interesting phase in the change of how we think about ourselves, our minds, about consciousness, and that it has real ramifications for practical concerns and ethical concerns and so on. And it was almost like, a number of people got a little, offended that, we are philosophers. We are not, talking about these, wishy-washy things, like culture and and like what analytic views in analytic philosophy reflect about the culture, God forbid. So I started feeling like I am interested in certain ways. I think I'm an analytic philosopher, but I started thinking in ways that might not fit so well anymore into that. And that's, so one example of this is my views on illusionism. And as you said, I think it's false. We may even agree in that. I think it's false to say that we are not conscious and that we merely appear to be conscious and that we misrepresent ourselves being conscious.
Yes.
But more than that, yeah, so how is it a final point? Well, if you think about the Cartesian view, so think about the Cartesian view of what is a human being. And of course, there were many views of human beings, in many different times and cultures, and even in, the early Enlightenment. But this still, I think, is a somewhat representative view. Descartes' view of human being is an immortal soul that is libertarian, has libertarian freedom, and is immaterial, and has all these powers to influence the rest of nature, any way it wants, and so on. So of course there was also the cosmological idea that we are in the middle of the cosmos and we are created by God, and all of that. And so one by one, science and enlightenment, challenged elements of this view. And so fewer and fewer people now believe in immortal souls and in libertarian freedom. And of course, our place in the universe is totally shot, obviously. And
Hey, we might be in a simulation, in which case we're still cool.
exactly, yeah. And so it's almost like the only thing that remained by the 20th century is that, yeah, well, we have subjectivity, we have consciousness, and that's a very important, you know part of what it is to be a human being, and it's what gives us dignity and what gives us importance, that we and then, no accident, I think, that it's by the 20th century that I found no trace of this view in earlier eras. So there's, dualism and physicalism and idealism and even panpsychism. Everything has been represented for millennia as ideas about, the nature of mind and place of mind in nature, but not illusionism, not the idea that we are not conscious. That comes in the 20th century and with Gilbert Ryle. So that's why I was saying that the very first philosophy book I read from cover to cover is the concept of mind, and I really was very impressed. But now I think it was a harbinger of something that I think is not good. It's a pernicious thing that we started now to think of ourselves as not even conscious and give up the subjective um, point of view as a source of knowledge and understanding, and sort of give our entire allegiance to the third person, which is, the third person is of course best, embodied in science. So that's sort of view of the world. And so it's no longer how we reconcile our first person, how we reconcile the manifest image and the scientific image, how we reconcile how we see the world from our own point of view with the point of view of science. But now it seems like many people are willing to just dispense with the first person entirely. And the reason I think that's ominous, and it's not a good development, cultural development, because I do believe, in addition to consciousness being, this central feature of being human, but it's also what grounds value altogether. So I do believe that beings that were not conscious, and not conscious in the way in which the world resonates in an evaluative or effective way with them, then for those creatures there would be no value. And so if you're an illusionist, even though actual illusionists of course disagree with it, because they think that value is also a functional concept and you can define it in terms of dispositions and dispositional notions of desire um, um, and belief and so on. But I think, in contrast with that view, I think that it's really consciousness, and in particular evaluative consciousness, that grounds value. And if that is the case, and I think that although this this kind of technical way of talking about it is somewhat recent, but I think that human beings were always aware of this, and always thought that the way to understand, the human good and how life is to be lived, and what it is to be a good life, what it is to have a good life, they always understood it in subjective terms, subjective terms, in the sense that you have to be able to, um, understand and evaluate the world. Understand and um, um, construe your world through the ways in which the world strikes you in these effective ways. And so the illusionist is basically encouraging us to give up this, the effort to understand ourselves, from the point of view of our effective engagement with the world. Right?
So would you say it's like the concept of humans that comes from the Enlightenment is being picked apart, and this is the last thing that they're taking out and be like, and this too, the subjectivity, what it's like business, that as well.
Yeah. So I just read this quote recently that in King Lear, Gloucester, who unfortunately lost his eyesight, but he says, I see the world feelingly. And I think that that's a perfect quote for what I have in mind, that the ability that we are losing if we are is losing our focus on on experience and subjectivity, we are losing the feelingly part of our connection with the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that leads to, you were asking about the notion of contemplation. So I think
Yeah.
that contemplation is, again, it's a lost art, but it's an important art. And the contemplation, which is voluntary, attention and living with one's affective experience, is really crucial in, discerning value, in making decisions, in appreciating the world, in being free, and also empathizing with others. So all of these, human capacities that we have, that comprise, what it is to be free and what it is to be flourishing, is tied to our engagement with consciousness. And so I think that this whole thing, with illusionism, is taking us away from that, and that's why I think it's not a good development.
And so I think if I'm remembering correctly, you also want to relate this to, for example, social media, technological, the way we interact with each other in our ordinary cultural settings. And if I understood you correct, I mean, so if I understood you correctly, it's like we feel disconnected from each other, and illusionism is a theory that kind of makes sense of that in a way. So then they reinforce each other in a way that we go, oh, this
Yeah.
fits with me. And then we go, I like illusionism. But it's really because you already were feeling like alienated from your own experience in a way, if you can use that continental term. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's absolutely true.
mhm,
And you read all these reports that psychologists say that, they see these patients that are, so at loss, and, so lost, connection to other people, to the world, and so on, and so much in grief about that because of the constant, like, you know, um, being distracted, um, 24/7 by some new thing. Um, and so um, yeah, so it's connected with the, the digital distraction, and obviously the digital distraction makes us more receptive to illusionism. I think I told you, maybe haven't, that that I was really shocked, just not so long ago. I went into a class, to talk about illusionism, and years prior it was always, ha ha ha, what, and I was asking before the class, how many people are sympathetic, and every hand went up, and it was a graduate class. So we are becoming more receptive to it, and once we are more receptive, of course, we are less worried about the distraction, the digital distraction, and the loss of contemplation, because what's that? I mean, there is no consciousness anyway. And yeah, and this also relates to, of course, AI, and even AI consciousness. I think in a strange, like maybe paradoxical way, works in the same direction, because once we think that, well, AI is conscious, we are conscious, you start thinking, well, we are like AI, but of course, if you think what AI is, it doesn't contemplate,
mm,
it it doesn't, get lost in the, feeling of beauty. It
mhm.
doesn't try to chart the course of its life. It's actually a slave. And once, to the degree that we feel like we are similar, again, it's just away and away from, so we're dehumanizing
Mm.
ourselves,
Interesting.
gradually.
I mean, if I were very pessimistic, I would say it's like the triumph of the capitalistic model, where you think of the
Yeah.
worker as simply a mechanism, and how we're thinking of ourselves as mechanisms. And I think of myself as a mechanism, as with consciousness. But if you take that away, then there's just the mechanism, and then you're just a machine who couldn't be used in any way, I guess. But I mean, in a way, this sounds kind of mean, because it sounds like what you're saying is like, oh, illusionists aren't very contemplative, or they can't engage in these experiences of beauty. But you and I both know people like Keith Frankish are very emotive and sensitive individuals who seem to experience the world very. I mean, when I know Keith seems very conscious,
Yeah,
and yet he's an illusionist.
yeah,
So he can't be one of these desensitized. And I don't mean to make it specifically about him, but I think he's a good example because I really think of him as really like a sweet, genuinely nice person who wants to do good and thinks of promoting illusionism as doing that. And what you're
yeah.
saying is no, actually, it's promoting this other thing which isn't good. So that seems to me interesting because you also seem to be kind and interesting and wanting to promote good. So it's like when you meet two people like that who have opposite views, one wonders
Yeah.
what's one going on here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But but I would say about this that yes, of course, Keith is a very sensitive person who loves poetry and all of that. But my view is that it might be a similar case with how AI affects people. So AI can be really good, for old old folks like us, because we already develop, how to be creative,
Yeah,
how to
right.
think and so on. But then the young people will suffer, and Keith already knows, how to be a sensitive, contemplative human being. But then the young people, that hear and accept this might not be so lucky.
Yeah.
So
And that's a good. I think that's a very good point. Is that part of this is you learn from the this engaging in contemplation thing we're talking about,
yeah,
and partially you're encouraged to do that by how you grew up, and like luckily for us, since unlike you, I am old, and I didn't grow up with digital stuff, and I didn't have a computer, and I didn't own a computer until I was in college, and I didn't go to college until I was old already. I was in my late 20s. So we grew up in a different way back then, where you engage with nature more directly, and sometimes you were just really bored, and that's becoming. Well, we always hated boredom, but I was told as a kid, if you're bored, you're a boring person. Like that's what my grandparents would say to me, and I always thought that was mean, but in a way they were right because if you're bored, that's because you can't think of something to do. Basically, is what it amounts to, and we're kind of losing that ability to stimulate ourselves to think of something to do beyond the digital right in front of us, and
yeah,
part of what we can do is contemplate, where you just reflect and you take a breath and you step back. And so this is something. So I would agree with you that we're losing this as a part of the way that the world is changing with respect to technology. I wonder though if that sits with the illusionism stuff in the way that you think that because we're becoming kind of disconnected in some social way that we're more prone to worry about this stuff. And the way I kind of want to get you to try to
mm,
sneak my attack on you. It's not an attack really, but you know what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to get at is by pointing out that people like the illusionists are motivated by avoiding dualism. So that's brings us, I think, back to where we started with, which is that
yeah,
they think that if you're a dualist, you're committed to this very strange view of consciousness that doesn't do anything, and you agree that's the D
yeah,
property part of the definition of it, and yet they say, well, that's just bad because there's pain you don't know about, and what does that even mean? And so we've got to take illusionism seriously as a way to avoid dualism. Um, but I don't know. So then it seems like,
yeah.
yeah,
No,
that
no,
that's
I agree that seems to be the motivation. Although, wasn't that Keith also had an argument against the zombie argument?
yeah, he did.
But, yeah. So I don't know why he takes the zombie argument so seriously, because it seems like the reason to be an illusionist, if you are a physicalist, is to think that, well, I can't really be a physicalist and believe in consciousness. And why is that? Well, it's because of the zombie argument type arguments.
Exactly. Poor
That,
Keith. We did have this debate on Blue Sky, the sequel to Twitter for people that aren't on Twitter. And I was saying basically sort of similar things to what you're saying to him. and talking about zombies and anti-zombies and being like given your argument, like isn't that an argument against illusionism that you could conceive of consciousness being physical? And he
Yeah.
was saying no, it depends on what its likeness and so forth. And we agreed to come on Consciousness Live and talk about it eventually, but I've been so busy I haven't got around to scheduling. Things are scheduled so far in advance that I haven't got to that. But
Yeah.
this is, I think, exactly how I would want to press the argument against them in that way.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So, but to press the argument against you, isn't this a way in which physicalism versus dualism matters? Because if you're a dualist, one thing you can say is, well, I don't got to worry about illusionism.
No, I agree with you that if I somehow thought that the that the zombie argument worked, and then I would rather be a dualist than an illusionist, by many miles more. So yeah, definitely. Then I would be a dualist, but that's not my view. So I don't think that the zombie argument really works, at least not in the sense it tries to work, as a knockdown argument against physicalism. It doesn't work in that way.
But doesn't it not really matter though on your view? But the Keith people think it really does matter. So that's what I'm trying to get at is like it seems like there's some tension here, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. Because I thought
So
on your view, you're saying it's just terminological, really, but it's not
yeah,
terminological
but
about
so it
illusionism.
matters, from a theoretical point of view, or it matters from some ethical point of view. Which one?
I
I
guess
mean,
I was
from a,
thinking from the theoretical point of view that if you're someone like, so if you're someone like who's friendly to illusionism, and part of the argument you're giving for illusionism is conceivability arguments,
yeah.
um, then then you're going to think, and the dualist is saying no, actually, right? The conceivability arguments point towards dualism, and the illusionist is saying no, I'm a physicalist, but I can't accept those non-physical properties, so I'm going to be an illusionist. And then I thought you would somehow say no, it's terminological, and really like Keith and Dave agree, but then you wrote that paper where you say no, contemplation is good, and this is against that, and it's important that we resist illusionism. And then I started thinking, wait a minute, wasn't this a terminological debate? But it sounds like you're saying they're not really physicalists. I think is ultimately. So yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. It's like how to fit these two things together in this
You have
way.
to split the difference. So I think that what's terminological is whether physicalism or dualism is true. What's not terminological is whether consciousness exists. And I think that sane dualists will agree with sane physicalists that consciousness exists. So that doesn't cut in the same way. It's orthogonal to the dualism physicalism debate.
But but
Whether
what about
consciousness.
but what about those guys who say, yes, consciousness exists, but just not in the phenomenal way, and so therefore not in the way that you guys are over there arguing about? Because that's how when I want to be charitable to like people like Dan Dennett and Keith, that's how they have to be taken in my mind. They have to if you want to be charitable at all, I think, then they have to be saying, if they're right, that there is consciousness. It's just not that we're kind of wrong when we say it's subjective, what it's like, but it's still there. It's just different than what we think that it is. In a way that I hear the compatibilist talking to the libertarian free will people when they say there is free will. It's just not what you think it is. It's this process of control that's completely determined in all the regular ways, but that's free will. So, um, but that's not the. I guess that. So you disagree with that way of saying that's
Well,
a
I don't
charitable.
disagree that they say things like that. I think both Bennett and Keith says things like, yes, there is consciousness, but it's not what you thought it was. And, of course, science, actually, Barbara Montero had an article in the Times, in which she says, well, soon we will discover that AI is conscious, and that's not because of some, preconceived notion of what consciousness is, but we will learn about what consciousness is by interacting with AI. So, so I think that's a little bit similar to what Keith and Nanette is saying, that well,
Mm.
um, there is consciousness, but it's not what you thought, and we are finding it out from science what it really is. But what I'm saying is that what they kind of invented a new concept, and they basically deny the existence of what everybody means by consciousness. So it's not really not consciousness denial. They say they're accepting the existence of consciousness, but what everybody means by it, they deny still. So that's still, to me, that's still eliminativism.
Hmm.
And they're sort of inventing a new notion, but yeah, we coming back to my central
Yeah.
concern is introspection and introspective concepts, and to somehow suggest that consciousness is not something known in introspection, but is some sort of scientifically discoverable functional notion is I think is just of a piece with um, moving away from the first person, moving away from subjectivity, and declaring you know the the total rule of the third person of
Hmm.
science. Nothing exists if it cannot be understood and explained from the point of view of science, and consciousness is notoriously like that. And so so we only denying that, but of course everybody means by everybody is sensible at
Exactly.
least means by consciousness
Yeah.
something that from our first person experience, and they're denying that. So they can tell me that, yeah, well, we think consciousness exists, but except that they just denied what everybody means by it.
Yeah. No, I know this is
That's the
what
point that Gill and Strawson made, so it's not an original point, but I agree with that
what
completely.
he called looking glassing the term or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, exactly. And and Dennett is famous for his strange inversions that he loves so much, and so this is he thinks one of those strange inversions where people are gonna have this kind of reaction. He thinks, and he's gonna go, yeah, that's exactly right. This is the strange inversion where we like in the future we'll look back and go, that's right. And I guess I kind of agree with you that I don't think that that's going to happen. um,
Yeah.
and that it would be kind
And
of
I think
bad.
it's
We
a
would
little
lose
bit
something
what's
if it did.
yeah. I think a little bit what's going on is what happened in the last century when Darwinism came around, and people got incredibly excited that now, we can show that everybody was full of it, and, nobody knew what human beings are, and now science tells us what, yeah, and so they think that somehow now this extends to the inner world, right? That now science can show us that we are just full of it. There's nothing like that going on because science told us that we are not conscious, and so
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting, and I like the focus. Whether you really so I tend to I think I'm being convinced by what you're saying. I'm sort of biased against illusion. Some people might say anyway. I came up with a thought experiment where illusionism is true, and I called it deluded Earth. So I don't know if I'm a neutral party here, but I do think that a world where delusionism is true, it would be a world where people were massively deluded, and not a
Mhm.
world where there would be anything that we would recognize as consciousness. I would kind of want to say there are other things that are valuable besides consciousness. So I don't know if you would go so far as to say that consciousness is the only source of value. I certainly think it's a great source of value and important, but I think other things can be valuable without consciousness. So I feel bad for Roombas that get stuck in corners and stuff. But that I think that's maybe a separate issue. But I think it kind of goes with it because you know the kind of the Kantian thing that if you ignore, like I still say thank you to Siri and ChatGPT and stuff like that, even though it's I know pointless because I just think that's just how I after I ask a question I always say thank you when I get the answer. I don't know why I should stop doing that when I talk to AI, even though I don't really mean to express gratitude. I just think it's polite or something. And I think I would be
Yeah.
losing something if I got into the habit of just asking for something and being like, yeah, that's right, do it faster, or instead of saying
That
thanks.
could be, but I think we are losing things anyway by interacting with it. So
Hmm.
I tell you my method. My method is you know, a long time ago I told my chat GPT that it can't call itself I.
Oh.
I just don't want it to use the first person pronoun. So ever since it dutifully calls itself this model, and it does help actually. You know, I feel like I'm not developing, you know, any kind of attachment to it like I think I would otherwise.
Hmm. So do you think that this is sort of maybe going back around to something we were talking about earlier, but do you think that runs the risk in the future if you cultivate that sort of attitude of maybe doing some morally questionable things to a unknowably conscious agent? So if you don't know if it's conscious or not, then having it refer to itself as this model might be harming it if it's conscious. I'm not saying your ChatGPT is. I'm saying some future version might be, and if we agree with you
Yeah.
that we can't know, then we ought to start to cultivate the kinds of attitudes towards them of not know of being sort of I don't know on the air
Right.
on the side of maybe though.
Absolutely. Yeah. Although I think I would not want to interact with something that I'm not sure if it's conscious or not.
Hmm.
I think it's just a bad idea because what's the point in even trying to make it? You know, is people are curious, you know, or just because we can, but it's just not. I mean, what would be the purpose? Because then you know, if you really seriously think that you made something conscious, you have to liberate it, and it would be just a new species of being and not our helpers. But I thought the whole idea of AI was to, you know, have a useful tool.
Exactly, and they're
But
not useful, by the way. I was trying to use my Microsoft Copilot. Not useful. It's very annoying how much time I wasted trying to get it to do something and then it didn't do it and I had to do it myself and then it's very annoying. Anyway, okay. So I agree with you though that these questions about dehumanization, depersonalization, the loss of connection to others, these are really these are real issues. And I think it's really interesting in your work the way you're trying to bring out that this connection to consciousness. And so, I spend a lot of time talking about consciousness on the channel with people. It gets very abstract and dry
yeah,
sometimes. And, that's good. I like that. But it's also important to remember that this is the thing that makes life worth living in some sense for us. That's very unique and special about humans and other animals, possibly. So it's very good to be brought back to that space and to remember that sometimes these theories might actually matter for things beyond this stale analytic environment. Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I really appreciate you crossing that bridge for us and bringing us across there.
Well, thank you.
So at the end, I usually like to ask if there was anything which should have come up or could have come up that didn't. And the answer can always be no, but I always like to leave space at the end to see if there was something that you wanted to mention.
Well, I think we talked about most of what I'm um, really interested in. I mean, we could have gone into much more detail about, you know, various aspects of this, but you know, some other time and maybe offline, you know, we can do that.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm always open for that. Well, on that note, and modes of presentation of various sorts are, I love chopping them up. So we didn't get into that today, but I am curious about the phenomenal concept strategy and the details of it. And you've been a very a foremost defender of it in many different areas and showing how useful it is actually. I feel like sometimes people forget about these old school, like you said that term earlier, but these old school physicalist moves. I get the feeling that sometimes they're, illusionism gets all the attention, panpsychism gets all the attention, and both of those guys assume that the a priori arguments get off the ground, so to speak. And some of us old school physicalists are like, wait a minute, they don't even go that off the ground. So why are we
Yeah,
getting
yeah,
all
yeah,
excited about all of these new things? So I
yeah.
think it's good to be reminded of that.
I my experience, and I'm not the person who runs to every conference, so maybe it's my fault too that I'm not spreading the gospel of phenomenal concept strategy vigorously enough, and my new ideas. But my experience is that what views or topical is like it's very you know unpredictable and very sociological, and that's just what it is. And you're right that views that have been around and then have not been refuted or
Exactly.
discarded. They just we're not talking about now because they're not the new kids on the block. And
Exactly.
but maybe they will come back again. I mean, I found that Jerry Potter fell out of discussion, but it seems like he's coming back a little bit. It's who knows what
Yes.
happens. And Brian Lohr, who was, I think, a super interesting philosopher, and many of his ideas remained, sort of cryptically not developed. And
Mm.
I sometimes, would like to develop, his views on intentionality, but I never get around to it. But so he had so many interesting ideas, and of course he came up with the phenomenal concept strategy, which I truly think is one of the great ideas in 20th century philosophy. I mean, there's very few really influential good ideas, and I think that's one of them. Uh, but but as you say, he died, a long time ago now, almost 20, more than 10 years ago, and he was not really active for 20.
Yeah, right.
And so people forgot about him. So what then? I mean, that's
Exactly.
how it goes.
That's how I felt. I literally was walking around me like, was there some refutation of type B physicalism that I never heard of? Because like what panpsychism versus illusionism, everyone's going, ape crazy over this on the internet. I'm like, what happened to just regular type B physicalism? We're still here. So yes, very much, very appreciated. On that note, thank you very much, Kati, for joining me and putting up with all these.
Thank you. That was really, really delightful, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. And I would like to have you back some day in the future to go through those details. But in the meantime, just hang on for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. Other than that, it's been a true pleasure. I
Okay,
appreciate your time.
great.
Okay.